the share. Okay, good.
Okay, folks are starting to roll in. Here we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Nick Hool. I'll be running kind of the administrative role today and helping out with the Q&A. If you wouldn't mind putting in the chat along the bottom hand of your window where you're calling in from and what brought you today, that can kind of get the conversation going there. Yes, welcome everyone. Oh, I see Jerry Box. Jerry and I have been communicating recently. Glad to have you on with us, Jerry. That's awesome. Good. I'll get the ball rolling. We'll be doing kind of a general conversation between Gary and Jonathan throughout this whole time, but then we'll have a more formal Q&A after the fact in kind of the last half hour, 40 minutes to bring you all into the conversation as well. And you can put whatever questions or comments you have in the chat or the Q&A function, and I'll read those out to Gary and Jonathan. Nicia, thank you from San Antonio. That's great. Okay, I think that's all the housekeeping I had to cover. Gary, anything I missed?
No, I think you got it, Nick. Other than just to say that we want this to be an interactive dialogue. And so, Jonathan and I'll, get a conversation going, but we would very much appreciate the participation of all who are on this call today. So if you're thinking about a question or comment, you can drop it in the chat, you can raise your hand, whatever. But we'd like others to participate in the conversation. So thank you, Nick.
Thank you.
So Nick, you can see the screen here, yes? I got my technology going. I'll probably
looking great. Yep.
Thank you. I love those moments where I get rolling, but not knowing my screen is not sharing. Exactly. So welcome everyone to our next rendition of entrepreneurship education, our entrepreneurship and education webinar series. I am beyond excited to introduce Jonathan Ortmans from the Global Entrepreneurship Network. I met Jonathan Jonathan has been more than a decade ago at Kauffman when we were just developing the Ice House program. We became acquainted and we worked together in Rio and many of the Global Entrepreneurship Congress events around the world that you've hosted. And the reason that I'm so excited to introduce Jonathan to this conversation is because I don't know of anyone who's doing more to promote entrepreneurship in a global perspective than Jonathan Ortmans and the work he's doing at the Global Entrepreneurship Network. So I'll just leave it there. Jonathan, welcome to the program, to the webinar. I'm going to stop screen sharing so folks can see you and welcome you and so welcome.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Gary. It's great to be joining you. As you mentioned, we've known each other for a number of years. In fact, I was looking at some of our Global Entrepreneurship Congress pictures from Moscow the other day. Don't ask me why they were popping up. And there you were. I think you've a great participant in the global entrepreneurial ecosystem work that we're doing. So, but it's good to be on this, and so great particularly at this point in junction to be joining the show.
Yeah, thank you, Jonathan. So the first question I want to ask you is, the big question is kind of why. Like, what's your why? How did you get into this? What is what is it you're trying to accomplish? Why is the entrepreneurship important to you?
Well, first of all, I mean, by background, I've had a couple of startups and a couple of exits. So I've kicked the tires and got to enjoy the sheer energy, reward, and impact of what it means to figure out a better way of doing something, to actually start a company, and indeed, in my case, to exit on a couple. I'm an economist by background, so I've always had a deep-seated interest in terms of how do you grow economies. I remember as a kid and in my economics classes sitting there thinking, this shouldn't be about dividing up the defined size cake. This should be about how do we create new value. It should be about how do we grow economies. And I think that coming together with the fact that it's become increasingly apparent to me getting into this concept of how do we help people and help communities leverage entrepreneurship, that entrepreneurs are front and central to what it takes in order to be able to help each other within a society. And so I think the reason I've really got into this is mostly because I felt like it's something I could contribute toward. I've benefited from the dynamics of entrepreneurial value creation, and I wanted to see that what we've seen in the United States and sometimes taken for granted 10 years ago or just over 10 years ago, when we really scaled our efforts at the Global Entrepreneurship Network around the world. We really wanted to make sure that this was an opportunity that could be experienced by anybody, anywhere in the world. And it wasn't just something that people just looked up to that shining city in San Francisco or Boston and said, one day we could be like that. And that's really the major transformation that I think we've seen happening over the course of the last decade.
Yeah. I mean, you and I are brothers in that regard. I mean, that's we did a research project for the Cisco Entrepreneur Institute in 2008 in San Jose. And they hired me to do a gap analysis on the entrepreneurship education ecosystem in the US, in North America. And it became apparent to me very quickly, Jonathan, that the way entrepreneurship was being characterized in a classroom was largely divorced from what a typical entrepreneur was actually doing. And that really became the impetus for launching Eli. And that's where the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative kind of came out of that. So Jonathan, I wanted to start by giving you an opportunity to tell the audience, tell the folks that are on this webinar who may be watching this webinar in the future, give us a little more specifics about what you do. What is Global Entrepreneurship Network all about?
Sure. Well, that's an easy question. I'll actually put a little slide up here for you while I just talk about it, because I'll give you a little bit of background. Let's see if I'm allowed to slide share. I think I can. Share screen. There we go. Just to give you a little bit of background. So we are based in the United States, but we operate programming in nearly 200 countries.
Wow.
In about half of those countries, Jen has opened up independent affiliate organizations. They're Jen countries, so it'd be Jen United Kingdom, for example. But the board of directors manages and controls and governs those Jen operations nationally in each country. So from an infrastructure perspective, we've really tried to have a global footprint to really be focusing on how do we build one global entrepreneurial ecosystem, one where it recognizes that national boundaries are porous to innovation, they're porous to the entrepreneurial startup culture, and to the entrepreneurial mindset. And if you look at the work that we do, we run a number of programs globally. We run initiatives for support programs, which are around how do you assist local entrepreneurs and startup communities by providing them with some of the best in class interventions to support entrepreneurs. One of the benefits of being global is we can test something in a lot of markets before we turn around and say, I think this actually works and it's useful to do. And so we do things like we have something called Startup Huddle, which is built on a kind of 1 million cups US model. We do a whole range of entrepreneurship education initiatives. We have our Gen Accelerates platform, where we're doing everything from doing angel investor training, mentor training, and entrepreneurial readiness training. We've got a wide range of initiatives that essentially support entrepreneurs in their efforts. We've got a grant program, very, very proud of that. multi-million-dollar grant program where we're taking support from foundations and giving it out globally in $10,000 amounts in light of the pandemic, for example. So we got a whole range of different ways that we actually help entrepreneurs and help those people who are building the entrepreneurial ecosystems around the world. A few other areas to emphasize. One is in particularly important that we'll come back to in this conversation is public policy. We are in the process of doing policy audits with governments around the world who are taking a very introspective look right now at how is it that we need, or what barriers might still exist in our ecosystem that's either stopping or slowing people from starting or scaling companies. And governments right now, I think, are waking up to this notion that new firm formation is, if anything, at least as important, if not more important, than supporting their existing small businesses, which has been their traditional understanding of entrepreneurship. And as we get more and more data from more and more economies that show that all the net new jobs are coming from firms less than 5 years old, it becomes vitally important that we help governments be startup savvy, that they understand what these barriers are, whether they're barriers to historically left behind groups in their communities, whether they're barriers because of regulatory issues, or what have you, whether the barrier is simply the lack of an entrepreneurial mindset in their population. Whatever has to happen, we've got to get governments more educated and more involved, particularly now that they're heavily investing in a post-pandemic recovery. We obviously have Gen Research. We have a variety of other areas. We have our Gen Invest division, which focuses on early stage investment vehicles and cross-border investing. And we have a whole range of different events. So for example, our big annual event we do every year, you and I just talked about, called the Global Entrepreneurship Congress. It's open to everybody, but it brings delegations from every country of the leaders that are really trying to build healthier entrepreneurial ecosystems in their communities throughout their countries. And so we try to very much do this in a global way, make it very inclusive, and work to try to bring the best in class programs, policies, and research to the leaders of these ecosystems around the world. And we've been very, very lucky to be supported by, in particular, the Kauffman Foundation, but we've been supported by others, including the US State Department, other foundations, and government agencies that have deemed this important work in bringing the smarts to their passionate startup communities and community leaders that are trying to really build this culture of entrepreneurship, this entrepreneurial mindset. So that's a little bit of an overview of Gen, probably more than you wanted, but obviously we're busily involved in this post-pandemic recovery and have rolled out a whole plan utilizing that infrastructure to see that entrepreneurs become front and center now in this economic recovery.
Yeah, no, that's really helpful, Jonathan. I love the sort of top down, bottom up. You've got everything from like the startup huddle, which is like a million cups. It's like I refer to that as like an AA meeting for entrepreneurs. It's a very grassrootsy kind of a thing. It's like going to church, right? It's like, how can we help each other solve our problems? And then the policy level. But I want to come back to that policy level thing for a second, Jonathan. I do a fair amount of reading about ecosystem building, and I know that you're well versed in that space. Probably more than anyone I know. But where does like education fall into that? Like I know there's the usual culprits. We need access to capital. We need regulatory policy that doesn't stifle this or make it so insurmountable. But let's go upstream and think about, at least from my perspective, the ways in which standardized education can unwittingly or otherwise, I'm not into the conspiracy thing, but the way formal education can stifle the development of entrepreneurial skills. Are you doing any work there in the policy discussion? Is there what's happening in that domain?
Absolutely, yeah. Well, I mean, first of all, Eli's work, the work of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative is just, vital in this regard, because we see in the education environment this odd juxtaposition of a very, shall I say, late adapter to the innovation environment in terms of infrastructure, the traditional university. And yet, if you travel across universities and other educational institutions, not just across the United States, but across the world, their entrepreneurial activity is alive and well and very much a bottom-up thing. So you're absolutely right. We've always maintained that you have to be working on both ends. First and foremost, building startup communities, building entrepreneurial ecosystems, creating these things is, as sometimes you and I described it, it's more about lighting candles. It's more about asking questions and getting people to answer them themselves. It's more about self-discovery, self-initiative, than it is about, you know, a very clearly defined curriculum. And I think this is an enormous contribution that you've made personally to this educational environment. It's helping people to understand that. But at the same time, we've got a lot of educational institutions and they come with a different culture. So I think the role of policy here is to make sure that we capture the best of both of those worlds, that we're able to capture the creativity, capture this notion of what it really means to learn about entrepreneurship with the kind of formal rigor and discipline that I know we all crave from academic institutions and from the kind of structural academic discipline that they can bring to our thinking, because we do have a tendency to cut corners, take shortcuts as entrepreneurs teaching ourselves. And I think we really need both of those kinds of environments. You know, one of the things whether I'm talking to really young kids, whether I'm talking to high school kids, or whether I'm talking to college students, or indeed just young people who are embarking. I had one of my favorite talks recently was to a room of 5,000 young people who all, their common denominator, they're all unemployed, you know, but they're all out of college. You know, who ever heard of holding a conference for unemployed people? I thought it was a fantastic idea. But whatever that generation is, I turn around and say to them, the first thing you've got to understand is that this is not about starting a company, okay? Entrepreneurship,
right.
This is about, what it's about is about conducting an experiment. It's about figuring out a better way of doing something. Once you start telling people it's about conducting an experiment, it gets terribly exciting, because all the people who typically were not excited by marketing and spreadsheets, they certainly weren't excited by a big corporate for-profit culture. You know, the people who came from different disciplines and backgrounds, didn't really know the creative communities, that they can relate to that. They can relate to the fact that there's a problem, and I'm going to conduct an experiment and collect some data and figure out a better way of addressing that problem. And
well, Jonathan, can I just jump in there for 1 second to interrupt you? That's such an important comment that you just made. I want to dig into for a moment, if you'll allow me, because I've been thinking about this. Like, it's a discovery process. Right? That's what entrepreneurship is. It's about discovering new ways to be useful to other humans. I mean, it's this more basic thing, but you just latched onto something that I want to just point out, and I'll shut up, which is that, you know, not everyone wants to start a business or manage a business, but who among us doesn't want to discover an opportunity? Right? And that's really an important distinction that you're bringing out, and I'll tie back to it later. But anyway, I interrupted you.
No. And that's really where I was going, this notion that we need to make sure, as societies across the world, if we're advancing entrepreneurialism as a notion of how can people self-actuate, how can they engage, how can they be part of creating solutions, we need everybody involved in that. We need not just the groups that have been historically left out or hard to reach, but we need people that come from mindsets and disciplines that aren't entrepreneurial. You know, one of the things I've given some talks to graduating classes at college, and one of the things I find fascinating is over the years is to see the increase in the number of people who say they're interested in actually joining a startup. And I've started rephrasing the question though, because one of the things I've learned is that I don't think, and this is something I'm going to say because I'm hoping you'll push back and we can have a debate about this if I've got this wrong, but I don't think everybody has an entrepreneurial mindset. But we need everybody to appreciate what an entrepreneurial mindset is, because sometimes when I've said, hey, how many of you would like to take the risk now you're graduating and start a company? And a bunch of hands go up. And then I say, how many of you would like to work for a startup? More hands go up, a lot of hands. So there's a lot of people that turn around and say, I like the culture of this creative environment. I like the notion. I can relate to what an entrepreneurial mindset is. But you know what? I don't quite see it in myself yet, but I see it enough to work as a team member with somebody else that's got that sort of disruptive, creative gene, who, by the way, wouldn't survive without me. You've got, I mean, that's one of the things we all tell teams in their starting companies, which is first and most thing is you got to have a mixture. You got to have this disruptive type, and you've got to have some people that are going to bring some order and discipline to it.
So Jonathan, you just stepped into like my little domain of entrepreneurial mindset, and I'm not entirely pushing back on what you said, but there's an important nuance to what you're saying. I'm coming at this from the perspective that non-entrepreneurial behavior is learned. That we're all born with this innate desire to contribute to the greater good, to solve problems, to be autonomous, to want to contribute, right? But not everyone's cut out to start a business per se. Not everyone's willing to step out, put themselves on the line. But I think that's what you're getting to, is you're seeing that desire. I want to contribute. I don't want to just be a drone in a large corporation somewhere. I want to be contributing. Now, there's another nuance that I want to sort of, it's not a bone that I want to pick, but it's that, I think the entrepreneurial mindset is mostly an effect rather than the cause of entrepreneurial behavior. So I mean, I think, we make this fundamental attribution error, which is that, oh, you've got this mindset and you don't. And I think, we can look at Jonathan. He just sold his business for millions of dollars, or, had some big event. He's got lots of employees. But if we do the Wayback Machine and look at Jonathan 20 years ago when he started, borrowed a couple $1,000s from his mother-in-law, he had very little of that. He didn't really know what he was doing. He was inexperienced. He didn't have much confidence. And the mindset ensued. But we make that mistake. We see the Jonathan of today and we think, oh, he's got an entrepreneurial mindset. So that's all I wanted to jump in on that.
You're absolutely right. It's not a you have it or you don't have it. I think the one thing that I think you do have some people that might have more of it than other is if they can recognize it, if they can appreciate it. I still think that, and unfortunately, I think thanks to work of people like you, I think we're seeing, an acceptance of this notion of a creative, innovative, entrepreneurial mindset, and the importance of it in solving any problem, even in a very traditional environment. So I think you're absolutely right, though. It's not a question of, oh, this person's got it, and this person doesn't have it. And the it is also something which is a constantly moving target. So I think we're absolutely on the same page with that. So.
Yeah. Another interesting component here, Jonathan, is that a lot of the entrepreneurs I've interviewed, as you know, I've been flying around the world interviewing what I would call everyday unlikely entrepreneurs, not necessarily the big venture-backed high growth types, but more common entrepreneurs. And what I keep hearing from these folks is I didn't really identify as an entrepreneur. Like I sort of stumbled into the pool, or I fell into it backwards, or and that's part of the question. So how do we redefine entrepreneurship in a way that invites those folks in? How do we develop intervention strategies or learning programs for people that hear the word entrepreneur and think, oh, that's not me?
No, I couldn't agree with you. This is really important, Gary, because when we designed Global Entrepreneurship Week, a very important concept that Wendy Gillis, now the president of the Kauffman Foundation, and Carl Schramm, the former president of the Kauffman Foundation, they had this notion that the value of doing something like Global Entrepreneurship Week was, of course, we were going to get out there, we were going to advance the entrepreneur culture, tell people all over the world that, by the way, you could be part of this success story if you want. You have the ability to be able to find your role in these ecosystems. But the most important thing that Carl Schramm said, I've always held on to, and that is that we need to tell people that at some point in your life, you may see the light go off and you may turn around and say, you know what, I think I could either co-found, or I could support founding, or I could found a company.
Right.
And I often tell people, what we're doing during Global Entrepreneurship Week is not telling you that you need to go out next week and become an entrepreneur. What we're telling you is you've got to be receptive. You've got to be observant. You've got to be asking yourself questions. You've got to be looking and seeing and finding those opportunities. And at some point in your life or in your career, you got to be ready and receptive when that moment suddenly happens. And for a lot of people, it's because, I love talking to the sort of Warby Parker guys, or, people that are in some of these industries that, just went on and on and on and on and just were, they were in these rote lanes. No one was innovating in the industry. And suddenly they woke up one day and said, I know this industry inside out, but I think it's got to be done differently. And now is the time to do it, because now I've got 10, 12 years unique knowledge of the industry, and I see all the weaknesses, but I also see all the opportunities, and I'm going to go out and I'm going to do it. That's not a wake up, I went on this entrepreneurial mindset course, or I woke up one morning after Global Entrepreneurship Week, or whatever is the exposure you have to entrepreneurs, or I read an inspiring story of an entrepreneur, and the next week I said, oh, I think I'll become an entrepreneur.
Right.
You never know
right.
what's going to happen. You never know when it's going to happen. And I think that's the most important thing we're doing, is we're saying, make yourself more receptive, as you've always taught us. Learn about what an entrepreneurial mindset is, because it can help you in all facets of problem solving in your life. And if you can test it generally in your work, your general as an employee, then you're going to be much more prepared for when that opportunity may come, where you actually say, you know what, I'm going to go out on my own and I'm going to create something new, figure out a new way of doing something.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Jonathan. I mean, that would be my advice to anyone is, start a side hustle. Start identifying and solving problems in your day-to-day life in some small way. And when I speak to, younger audiences, a big question I'm always asking, Jonathan, is how can you make yourself more useful to more humans? And I think, I was all proud of myself when I sort of came up with this idea that that's really what it comes down to, right? It's like, it's one human being trying to figure out a way to make themselves more useful to more humans. And I thought, that's it. That's what it's really about. And then I was greatly humbled when I learned that Sophocles, it was Seneca wrote this in his essay on leisure in like 64 AD, that it's the duty of a man to make himself useful to his fellow man, as useful as possible to as many as possible, because to do so advances the well-being of mankind. I mean, to me, that speaks to the essence of what entrepreneurship is. Whether your name is on the building or not, is irrelevant, right? Whether you actually own the business, it doesn't really matter. And I think, another thing we can talk about, Jonathan, is that what I've noticed is if you start to look at what are entrepreneurial attitudes and skills, I mean, let's back up one step. And you sort of alluded to this in your opening comments, but when you look at an entrepreneurial person, and I'm using the word entrepreneurial sort of like a tongue in cheek with millennial, they don't necessarily own the business, but they're hungry to make change. They're active in some entrepreneurial way. These are people that are identifying and solving problems. They're taking initiative. They're resilient. They're resourceful. They're creative, critical thinkers. They have all the very same attributes that employers demand. The employers just don't call them entrepreneurial skills. They call them soft skills or some other name. I just think that's an important nuance in the dialogue around helping to shift entrepreneurship to make it more mainstream.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I do think we have to be careful that, I guess I've been cautious not to just make it another interchangeable adjective to indicate someone has initiative or is creative, because in a way, having initiative or being creative, I would want to use those words. I think the difference is that you can have all sorts of great ideas. I mean, I have so many of my friends that I know, some of the smartest people I know, they're incredibly insightful and extraordinarily well read. But sometimes I have a hard time getting anything out of their heads. And I think the difference here is that it's someone who does undertake, who takes action, and does so with a sense of confidence. But so you've still got, yes, that innovative, creative initiative and insight, but you're doing something with it. And I think that's one of the critical
action orientation.
Yeah. Got to be action oriented, because there's a lot of us that spend a lot of time. I mean, I do it in other parts of my life. I mean, I'm embarrassed that I don't take more action on some of the things that, I think we should all be contributing towards. I mean, I do a lot of thinking about sustainability and the environment and our planet, and, every day, all the things we do that either help or don't help that. And I wish I could do more, but of course we all do as much as we can with a number of hours in the day. But I think, it's definitely got to be action oriented. And I think that's one of the exciting things. I want to pick up on one other thing, if I could, because I think this is extremely important right now. And it's the basis of our work at Gen in 2021. So we have a theme throughout all of our managing directors around the world, all of our communities, all of our staff, our support teams we call it the 3 R's. It's reboot, rethink, and regenerate. And we sort of keep it as an underlying drumbeat to what we're trying to do. We're all trying to, as they say, build back better. We're not trying to just recover from the pandemic. We're trying to say it forced some changes in attitudes and the ways that people think and do things, ranging from the obvious, like we're all now comfortable looking at cameras in a way that we weren't comfortable talking to our laptops, right. 8 months ago, or at least, where it was 10%, where now we got 80% that are. But I think one of the things that we recognize that's central to this notion of what an entrepreneur is, that you and I have been talking about, is that at times like this, with enormous uncertainty, a terrible amount of fear, trepidation, a lot of a complete lack of predictability, that entrepreneurs become vital in our societies in every aspect, because they're used to disrupting traditional business models. They're used to an environment where someone comes in and overnight changes all the rules. And all of a sudden, everything that they evaluated and did the data crunching around that wasn't viable in the past might be viable, and vice versa. And they don't look at that with any sense of fear. they actually, a lot of them, they're like, hey, guess what just happened? Someone just opened up an entire new box for me to go and play in, okay? Because they just fill the rules. So they look at it with a sense of, and of course, you know, with a pandemic, there's absolutely nothing to celebrate. But they do look at it with a sense of confidence, with rigor, with challenge. And so what we're front and center trying to do right now, whether it's heads of state and governments, or whether it's cities, or whether it's, most importantly, all the institutions, the educational institutions and the institutions of our societies, is say, you've got to do everything you can to make it easy for those people with that entrepreneurial mindset, with that sense of courage and confidence, to really do their part over the course of the next 2 to 3 years, because this will be a transformational period in the world's economy in a way that it's never been before. I mean, the one thing that struck me as absolutely inexcusable for our world when this pandemic hit is that it was tailor-made for a global response. We didn't have heads of state all convening in one location in secure circumstances to work out how's the world going to, I mean, for the first time in our lives, we had something that was the same common enemy to every citizen in the world. It was a pandemic, okay, this virus, and the fact we didn't have a global response. And so what we're really keen to try to do is say, it's one thing we should be global about, which is we've got to get behind our entrepreneurs. We've got to put them front and center. We've got to, you know, I mean, Carl Schramm used to phrase it very nicely. He used to say, you know, we can't have them as the side ring in the circus anymore. These guys really are the people that we need to empower to be leading us and pivoting us out of this pandemic. And so I think that mindset, understanding that mindset and recognizing it in yourself is vital to you having the confidence to be a leader in a post-pandemic world.
Yeah, I love that, Jonathan. You know, your comments remind me of a phenomenal book, and maybe Nick can put a link to it in the chat there, from Nassim Taleb, his book Anti-Fragile. And his point was that which you spoke to very clearly, Jonathan, that there's no word, and he looked at, you know, I don't know, 120 languages or something. There's no word for anti-fragile. Like, and he described it like this: if you push a wine glass off the edge of the table, it'll hit the floor, it'll shatter, it's fragile. If you wrap it in bubble wrap, push it off the table, it won't break, but it doesn't benefit from falling off the table. Anti-fragile is the term he uses to talk about systems in nature that actually benefit from the shock. Right? They get stronger from the shock. And that's what you're really speaking to. And I think, you know, that's, you know, this is a nuanced thing, but, you know, he's saying the word resilience is about bouncing back, but anti-fragility is benefiting from it. Now, you know, Martin Seligman would probably take issue with that because he's done a lot of research that demonstrates the ways in which shock and stress actually benefit the individual. But you're absolutely right. That's the missed opportunity, if you will, in any, you know, any tragedy, any crisis is a terrible thing to waste, so to speak. And I love the way you're thinking about that, Jonathan. Is like, how can we use this global, like, what are the lessons we can learn that'll make us stronger going forward? Your message also links up with what Yuval Harari is saying in 21 Lessons, right? The big challenges in the world can't be solved by nations anymore, by individual nations. They require global cooperation. There's no way that, like, nuclear proliferation or global pandemic or any of these big issues can be solved by one country. I don't want to take us off in the weeds too much, but it's a great point.
No, I mean, it's vitally important. And I do think it's more than resilience. I think resilience was a very important concept that we were all embracing at the beginning of the pandemic, because it's about surviving at the beginning of the pandemic. But right now, as we come out of this, it's not just a question of missed opportunity. It's a question of the fact that we have a lot of uncertainty. And I think we need to turn to the people who are best equipped and most experienced at dealing with that kind of uncertainty.
That's exactly right.
I think entrepreneurs are vitally important to that process. They've tested themselves, but it's that spirit that they bring in terms of not panicking in an environment where, as that famous adage goes, you can actually build the airplane in the air.
Right.
And but that's very counter to the way that our traditional, I sometimes rather rudely refer to them, late adapter institutions have been structured to think over the last 300 years, which is you can't build the airplane in the air. You have to test and test and test on the ground first. And I think that entrepreneurial mindset brings with it the ability to mitigate risk and to be able to tackle things considerably faster than we used to be able to in the past. So,
yeah. Well, Jonathan, and I want to open this up for comment. I see Nick, and you can chime in here, but I see questions in the chat here, so I want to give other people a voice in this conversation. But it's into what you're just saying is very interesting to me, because I'm interested in the ways in which other directed learning and other directed value creation might be inhibiting young people from developing. I mean, I think it's the other directed versus self-directed, that it's not an either or situation. But I think, when you speak to that mindset, the not like, let's ask the question, Jonathan, what is a non-entrepreneurial mindset? Right? And if you start to think about what that is, we can start to understand the ways in which other directed learning, other directed value creation might hinder our ability to develop entrepreneurial attitudes and skills. The last thing I'll say, Jonathan, and I want to turn this over to the panel, to the group, is in the domain of like other directed versus self-directed. Now the question just flew right out of my head, so maybe it's time for me to shut up. Nick, do we have questions in the chat? Any questions, comments? I see at least one in the Q&A.
Yeah, there's a good question, actually, kind of leading from where you were going with your last comments, Gary, from Sergio Ortiz at Tecnológico de Monterrey, our friends there at Tech. He says, entrepreneurial education has become almost a commodity. Design thinking, lean startup, business model canvas, pitch for VC, etc., becoming, in a sense, a simplistic approach. What do you think we can do to have a more integral vision for entrepreneurship education?
Jonathan, I'll let you take the first stab at that one.
Well, well, first of all, the field of entrepreneurship education is still relatively nascent. It's compared to other disciplines that have been taken on by educational institutions across our societies, is the first point I would make. The second thing I would say is that observing entrepreneurship education around the world, Gary and I have already pointed out there's a lot of it which is self-directed by the individual students. As I like to say, there's more entrepreneurship education going on in the corridors outside the classrooms than there is inside the classroom sometimes. But I think the most important point we have to look, if you look at Lean Startup, or you look at all of the examples that you gave in your question, and of course there are many more, is that yes, it's messy. Partly because it's still relatively nascent, but partly also because of the nature of what it means to learn about entrepreneurship. We came at this field through a very different door. The door we came at it was business schools, which of course teach people how to run existing large companies. They don't really teach people how to start companies. We came at it from a more traditional academic view of this was business education. It was about spreadsheets and marketing and sales and, some of the more traditional technical things. And of course, what's evolved alongside the notion that it's around innovation and technology and figuring out new ways of doing things, that it's a creative experiment, as we were just discussing. What's evolved is this rather messy process where you don't actually want to put lines around it. You don't really want to come up with one standard, in my view anyway, set of schools of thought in terms of how do we teach this. So I'm actually quite comfortable with it being a little top down, a little bottom up, with it being a little messy. And I'm okay with us going through phases where, we go through 6-7 years of lean startup, and then we're moving on to, to something else. I think, we have that's what brings the imagination, it's what brings the invention of new ways of what Gary and I were talking about, which is lighting the candle in the hearts and minds of people who were trying to say, maybe you at some point in your life might see the entrepreneur inside of you. So I think, so I guess I'm not frightened about the lack of organized, structural, shall I say, infrastructure around how we teach entrepreneurship. And I'll just add one other thing. Of course, I've been to Monterrey, and I've been to the Inc. conference there a couple of times. Spoke at Inc. last November on the virtual one. I've spent a fair amount of time in Mexico, but I look at all the other countries. When I look at, for example, we took our Congress to Medellin in Colombia, and the way people are learning and thinking about what it takes to become a risk taker, to embark upon this journey is very, very different. And so I think the joy of what's happened with the online learning world is that you can pull different ideas, methodologies, approaches, and ways to doing it from anywhere around the world now. It's and we've already discovered that teaching and understanding and learning about entrepreneurship is one of the things where it's perhaps one of the most common cultures across the world. And I think that, I never like to say one size fits all in any field, but it's pretty close. I mean, I used to tell people, come to our event from every country on the planet, which we have people there from, 100 people from every country we work in. And leave your passport at the door, pick another one up on the way back, and you'll fit right in wherever that person came from. There is this common notion. Gary calls it the mindset. I don't think you necessarily need to have a word around it, but I certainly think that we need to understand that there is this common culture across national boundaries. And I think we need to allow that messiness to occur in the way that we're teaching and learning about becoming an entrepreneur.
Yeah, it's interesting, Jonathan. And Sergio, I really appreciate your comments. They're particularly striking coming from Tecnológico de Monterrey, which I think is somewhere in the top 10 entrepreneurial universities in the world. We've done some work, a lot of work there. I have a lot of friends at Tech. But Sergio, I think you're answering a very interesting question. And what I want to tie this back to is what Jonathan is saying is like the field of entrepreneurship is not only nascent, but it's not well understood. And I think, the subject of entrepreneurship remains fraught with all manner of popular myths and common misconceptions. Top 5, holy mackerel, wow. But the space is fraught with all these myths and misconceptions about entrepreneurship that lead us astray. And I think, so Sergey, I'm going to use your question to ask Jonathan another question, a segue. I'm intrigued by this concept put forth by the World Economic Forum that, it's not enough to add entrepreneurship on the perimeter. And to your point, Sergio, there's entrepreneurship programs, they got incubators now and startup and lean and all this stuff on the campus. But how do we shift it from the perimeter to the core of the way education operates? And I think that's where the challenges are going to lie, is we have to redefine it in a way that everyone can embrace it. And what I mean by that, and Jonathan, you spoke to this right from the rip, is I think that most of the world thinks of entrepreneurship. We hear that word and we think of it in a binary way. You're either going to start a business or you're going to become an employee. And so there's no middle ground. It's like, oh, you want to join a startup? You want to be part of the startup world? You go down that track. Otherwise, you want to be an engineering major? You don't need to know about that. Or you want to be a nurse or whatever. We need to redefine it in a way that more people can participate in the conversation. That's my answer to the question, but I don't want to. Let's just go from there. Nick, what other questions do we have?
Yeah. Clint Day is asking, and so actually this dovetails really well into what we were just talking about. How do we take entrepreneurship education mainstream? So, well, within the context of what you both were just saying, of it being messy and not maybe a one size fits all, but not a one prescription for all perspective, with the concept of workforce going through a large scale change with AI, automation, expanded gig economy, et cetera, not to mention COVID that we've been talking about. What are some pointers? And he suggests maybe mandating entrepreneurship training through even the K-12 sector.
Yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit. Every now and again as a parent, I'm tempted in the busyness of the day to just try to tell my kids what they got to do and do this. And then every now and again, my wife pulls me aside and beautifully reminds me that, slowly, you've got to think about how you're going to incentivize them to do that, or maybe just ask a question, let them, connect the dots, And I think the same's true about getting, whether it be governments or traditional educational institutions, getting them into the entrepreneurial mindset is not something, and excuse me, governments, educational institutions, and the public at large, okay, this is really important. I mean, we do Global Entrepreneurship Week, for example. We tell everybody, look, we're bringing all of you evangelists for entrepreneurship, all the people who are already converted. You're starting companies, you're running accelerators, you get this, you know what we're talking about. Come with us, stand on our side of the line. Our mission is to come together, hold hands during 1 week in November, and to put on 40,000 shows around the world that try to get the public to understand what on earth we're talking about and why we're so excited about it, and to maybe see at some point in their life that they could be part of that journey. Now, the reason I bring this up is because the way to do this on the education side is I don't think we can mandate it. The Kauffman Foundation about 15 years ago embarked upon a really fantastic experiment called the Kauffman Campus Program. And they gave $50,000 challenge grants to universities. And they said, come back to us. I forget the numbers, but the foundation was willing to put in significant multi-million-dollar matching grants to universities that could come back with the best ideas for how they were going to put entrepreneurship within every discipline on campus. So it wasn't a question of saying, oh, why isn't it physics, chemistry, economics and entrepreneurship? It's, why don't we, the idea was, how do we put entrepreneurship in every discipline? Because of course we always had it in business schools, but that wasn't really producing entrepreneurs. So by and large, I think the conclusion of that experiment, and I'm sure someone can correct me, but was probably that I don't think universities are the ideal #1 place that you're going to seed entrepreneurship throughout your economy. I think they're going to play a role and be very, very important. And I think at that time, part of the thing is that just that very thing, you can't force what is a very messy creative process on a very traditional institutional infrastructure. But I think what you can do is you can just get on with it in the pockets within campuses and universities and within disciplines on campus where it's working. So if you see in the engineering school, there's just a whole bunch of engineers and just see what they're doing, people want to emulate that. They want to see that. They want to start bringing the entrepreneurship curriculum. So in a way, we have to show them, not tell them, the other disciplines. We do Global Entrepreneurship Week, for example, we do it on university campuses in a very significant way. And part of the reason for that is we get every department on campus to do something during GW to get them at once, to think about, how do we, whether it be on the healthcare and the medical side, or whether it be on, energy and the environment. I mean, entrepreneurship is now, we're disrupting every single traditional model of delivering every kind of good or service or solving every kind of problem with entrepreneurship now. And so there really isn't anything left on campus that you couldn't turn around and say it could benefit from having some kind of entrepreneurial component of what that discipline is trying to address. So again, I want to be careful that we don't turn around and say entrepreneurship is the only answer to every problem, and that everybody in society needs to be a risk taker and an entrepreneur. I do think, however, that we need to put entrepreneurship curriculum in every discipline, because it's from all disciplines that we're going to come up with these new, very high-powered, creative, innovative solutions. And there really isn't any kind of field left now that will not be disrupted in some way, shape, or form by entrepreneurship. Even in some of the basic science fields that then go on to produce the innovations of tomorrow in all the different industries in our society. You can't just say, oh, it's not a linear process, as MIT taught us. It's this constant sort of collaborative process that occurs throughout the process of doing. So I think there is a role for and I think the solution to it, though, if I could just say, is get on and do it, and allow your students to be getting on and doing it, and have them show off, or just, I think people will copy, people will emulate, because one of the things about the entrepreneurial culture, particularly on campuses, is it's kind of fun. I mean, that's why a lot of people say, I don't know if I'm an entrepreneur, but I'd sure love to go work for one, because it's so exciting, this concept of, starting and creating something from new and doing it like this. So I think that's probably the first answer I would have to give is you can't mandate it. You're just going to have to lead by example and make it fun. It is already a very collaborative community, social experience. Most of the people involved in entrepreneurship, quite frankly, are having a good time. They're enjoying themselves at the idea stage. And so I think that's the way, is you got to make it sticky, you got to make it exciting, you got to make it appealing, so that others on campus see it as for what it is, which is a creative problem-solving set of experiments, rather than, oh, I don't like those business school guys over there. They're all going to turn out to be people in suits and ties that go and exploit the planet and make a lot of profit and, exploit the poor. Yeah. So I think we've got to really show off the really lovely parts of what it means to create something new, to birth the new.
Yeah. Well, Jonathan, you nibbled up against the edge of a really important point that I've struggled to make for in the academic world, is that entrepreneurship education, when done properly, creates a very powerful incentive to learn. It's fun, right? Like, learning becomes self-directed. And that's really, once that shift occurs, learning becomes fun. The teacher's role becomes much more gratifying, much easier, and so forth. So I just wanted to add that point. But to the question that was asked, Jonathan, you're talking about the Kaufman's initiative in higher education. I'm advising the Ministry of Education in South Africa. Margie Worthington Smith, who's the former head of Alan Gray Orbis in Cape Town. I've been working with her for a few years now. They do have a K-12 mandate to put entrepreneurial mindset in the entire K-12 curriculum in South Africa. So that's really an exciting initiative to see and to be a part of. But, you know, to answer the question in a more practical way, Clint, I would say, I always defer to Jaime Casab, the former head of Google Education, when he said, you know, stop asking kids what they want to be when they grow up and start asking them what problems they want to solve and what do they need to learn in order to solve those problems. I think those kinds of questions repeated over and over and over again in the classroom will help create that tectonic shift that'll lead to greater human capital.
Gary, I want to endorse your notion that I think on the K through 12 environment, I was more answering on the higher ed side.
Sure.
I absolutely agree that you've got to have, and whether you dress it up with words like design thinking or whether you look at it, you know, as traditional curriculum, I absolutely think it's something worth putting in the curriculum. Years ago, in fact, some entrepreneurs, non-Japanese entrepreneurs, actually created a school, which is now a thriving, successful school in Tokyo, on the notion that we wanted to teach like they teach in the public schools in Silicon Valley more than the way we teach traditionally. And part of that was coming up with just what you're talking about. You know, how do you solve problems? It's packaging it in a very different way. I might just add, you know, we actually created Global Entrepreneurship Week with Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And one of the things that he did at the beginning of the campaign is that he mandated, which of course you can do in a country the size of the UK, where the Department of Education controls all the schools. It's not like school districts in the United States, where he said, actually, during Global Entrepreneurship Week, every school in the country has to participate. And it was great, but the way we made them participate is we gave them creative exercises. So we did something called, for example, you know, make it with a tenner, where every student through the banks got £10, and during the week they had to come up with a creative way of making money. The ironic thing is 90% of the money that the banks sponsored on this, they expected to never see again, 90% of it they got back. You know, and that was just challenging, you know. So, you know, so I think the idea of putting it in the K through 12 thing is a really important thing. But I wouldn't necessarily want to dress it up. I wouldn't necessarily want to put it as a formal label of, oh, you have to do the entrepreneurship curriculum. It could be more, just got, you know, teaching the essence of what you've been teaching and writing about for over the years, to do with what an entrepreneurial mindset really is.
That's right.
So
That's right. And Jonathan,
yeah.
To that point, what I bristle sometimes, because I see when educators are told, okay, you got to do entrepreneurial things, they tend to default to teaching business management skills.
Mm-hmm.
You need to learn how to pitch an idea, or you need to learn how to like manage money or do things that are important, but they're not really entrepreneurial, which is about the discovery process. To your point, you know, Tecnológico de Monterrey, they used to do this thing. I don't know if they still do it, and maybe the folks here that are on the call, Sergio, you can speak this, but like all the incoming freshmen, every one of them, there's 120,000 students across 30 campuses. This is not just a university in Boston or Silicon Valley. This is Tecnológico de Monterrey is spread across Mexico. And every single student, and Sergio, correct me if I'm wrong, but every student it participates in something, I forget what they call it, but they're given like 1,000 pesos. Groups of like self-organizing groups of 3 or 4, you're given 1,000 pesos in a couple of days, and you're sent out into the world to figure out how to come back with more than 1,000 pesos. There's no other instruction beyond that. And I had the honor to interview in the studios at the main campus in Monterrey several groups of students that were reflecting on this experience. Jonathan, this was absolutely incredible. So first of all, each group of students was not privy to the other group's response. And what I heard over and over, yeah, look at what Raphael is saying. Hey, Raphael, good to see you. But last year they generated more than 400,000 US dollars in that experiment. So not only they came back more than 100%, the point, but what the students said, Jonathan, was so interesting to me. And more than one group of students said this to me. After I had that experience, my mindset changed in a way that I said, I'm no longer going to let the teacher tell me where the bar is. I'm going to decide where the bar is. I'm not going to walk into the classroom and say, what do I have to do to get the A? I'm going to walk in the classroom saying, I'm going to master this material. That's the power of entrepreneurship education, in my view. And so Sergio was just saying here in the comments that some of the outliers came back with more than 50,000 pesos. And this is in a couple of days, right? This is in total chaos. As you said, Jonathan, it's just a messy experience there. So anyway, that's a great concept. And I think, you guys at Tech, you got a little bit of an unfair advantage that I just want to call you out on. And that is that the university was created by an entrepreneur with an entrepreneurial intention from the get-go. And I had a chance to interview the president, Alva, a few years back, and that's why the university was created, to promote entrepreneurial spirit. The mission statement of Tecnológico de Monterrey is to have every graduate leave with emprendedora mentalidad, and that's the extent of my Spanish. I'm sorry, but an entrepreneurial mindset with a global reach and humanity. And please correct me here, Sergio or Raphael. I'm butchering it a little bit, but it's such a beautiful mission statement that I love to share that whenever I have the opportunity. But it's about getting all students exposed to the entrepreneurial mindset. I know what it was, with a humanistic outlook. That's the piece I was missing. Yeah. What other questions do we have, Nick?
Yeah. Just piggybacking on the point you just made, a lot of the causes that the students were going through during that entrepreneurial challenge with a human aim, that's the challenge, that's what they call it, at Tech. Almost all of those funds went back into social impact initiatives that were being put on by senior students. So just that humanistic outlook is from the get-go. It's not purely the making of the money, right? So just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. It's a great point, Nick.
So the initiatives that we were just talking about at Tec de Monterrey are speaking to a question Donald asked, and some folks answered him in the chat, but I wanted to get both of your takes on this as well. Do you know of any university or groups of schools who teach reinventing or managing a turnaround beyond a single class? So maybe a department or a full, college. And some folks mentioned Babson or CMU MEV's program. High Point University in North Carolina has an entrepreneurial department, but any other departments that are doing it well that either of you can mention?
I don't have a lot of details, but Arizona State, I think, and Stanford both have, I think, addressed that quite well. But Gary, you may have a better sense of it.
So I'm sorry, Nick, I was trying to respond to a comment. Could you please restate the question for me?
Any other programs beyond Tech, Babson, CMU, High Point University in North Carolina that have these entrepreneurial concepts, reinvention, managing a turnaround, pivot points, things like that. Everything we've been talking about beyond just one singular class or small set of classes. Someone who's doing it on a bigger scale, like a department or having their own college of entrepreneurship that you can think of.
Yeah, I don't know of any off the top of my head, Nick. And I think a lot of people are trying, as Jonathan said, the world's waking up to this idea. but I think it's fairly new in the United States, and you know, it's a hard shift to make, specifically, as Jonathan said, in the university setting. It's not an easy shift
Right.
to make. You know, there's an interesting. Go ahead, Jonathan. You got something?
Say, you know, one of the things. I mean, almost everybody in every industry discipline, in every entrepreneurial ecosystem constituency, and by that I mean, you know, whether they're the educators or the accelerators or the investors or the you know, entrepreneurs themselves, as Brad Feld says, the leaders, across the board, and in every country. Experts who've been working in this field for 20 years, and new entrants into the field, everybody is engaging in this broader question of how do what will happen in a post-pandemic environment. I mean, every investor group I know, I mean, it's phenomenal. I mean, our investor communities around the world, we have 80 angel investor networks, 80 countries. And they used to never really want to interface with each other because they always considered to be early stage investing was always a very local thing. And unless you really knew that industry or knew that economy or knew that culture in that particular ecosystem, you didn't really fly overseas and invest. I mean, you know, those 500 startups would have geeks on a plane, and you'd have a few exceptions to the rule. But generally speaking, I mean, right now we're seeing sort of 80% cross-border investing going on. So you're seeing this dramatic change, but part of this is around the fact that everybody's looking at, you know, where are the opportunities that have the headwinds? Where are the opportunities that have the tailwinds? So the turnaround is happening in terms of entire economies and individual companies. So I really don't think there's a single brain that's not thinking about this to some degree right now, which is this, you know, how are we going to, you know, what is everything going to look like in this post-pandemic environment? Because I think it's as I say, you have to look at it with a sense of optimism, because you have to look at it with a sense of how are we going to make more people's lives better as a result of this, rather than, oh my gosh, how are we going to help all our restaurants recover? I mean, these are important, you know, immediate short-term things that governments can worry about in terms of infusions of investment capital and grant programs and you know, but you know, we've got our own grant program like that, for example. But I think, you know, the big picture here is how do we repaint the picture? And whether
that's it.
Things like equality, inclusion, you know, including more of the communities that were left out, which are very different in every country we work with, you know, or if, you know, whatever is your definition of how we make entrepreneurship more accessible to more people, or how we make the planet more inclusive to what we're trying to achieve as a society. It's a very exciting opportunity in many respects, and it's one that I think you got a lot of brains and a lot of people that I mean, a number of people I could never get access to because getting access to them really meant, you know, getting them to get on an airplane. And the fact that we've now got this extraordinary ability to say, I only want 30 minutes of your time on a Zoom call so we can get deep into this insight thing. And by the way, you can flip from something else. There's no travel time. I mean, that means that there's a lot of brains deploying themselves in things that traditionally they wouldn't do. I mean, I'm doing 50 times the number of things that I traditionally would do because of the fact that I don't have to go anywhere. So
yeah, for a fraction of the cost.
For the fraction of the cost. And time,
yeah,
time more than anything else.
Yeah, there's another interesting dilemma here, Jonathan. I don't know if we have enough time to get into, but I just want to throw this idea out there. That in times of disruption and change, expertise often becomes a liability. And I've studied this a fair amount. You know, I'm the mindset guy, right? I've studied like what's called cognitive entrenchment. Right. And so what I'm seeing from a lot of big thinkers in this domain is that the way forward with increased volatility, uncertainty, VUCA is the sort of military term for that, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. The way forward is through trial and error rather than expert leadership. And the data is quite clear that this is where we get stuck. When the world changes, experts often struggle the most to adapt, and we often respond inappropriately to change. And we do that, the most common way that we respond inappropriately to change is we tend to double down on our current way of thinking. We ask everyone to work a little harder for a little bit less. We try to pedal a little bit harder. We try to get a little more. George Land used to call this a siege mentality. And that might get us through the short term, but it often is the hallmark of destruction, right? That we cling to a belief system. It's the beliefs that need to change. It's not ratcheting up the efficiency. There's a lot to unpack there, but I just wanted to put that out. That's part of the entrepreneur's dilemma.
Yeah, and I think part of the way out of that dilemma is, as I often like to emphasize, I honestly think that it's a symbiotic relationship between someone that brings unique knowledge and experience, and as you say, potentially entrenched thinking, alongside with someone that is a little bit more flirtatious with their thoughts, in the sense that, why don't we go off in this direction? I mean, we see that sometimes internally in our own culture. We have new employees that come in and they're like, well, why don't we just do this? And let's just do this. And of course, some of the old timers, we look at ourselves and say, yeah, well, I can give you 10 years of reasons why we're not going to go in that direction right now, and so you might think that's entrenched thinking, but that's actually a really healthy to and fro, to think about, okay, so how do we open some doors, but not all doors? How do we bring some rigor in, maintain some, because as someone that loved reading history, I'm delighted my teenager loves history. And I'm so happy about it, because for all of the speed at which everybody's, jumping to conclusions and let's do this, and now we can do everything a lot faster, and technology sped us stuff even up more, and then the pandemic came and all of a sudden changes happened even faster. It forces you to sit back and say, what happened over the last few hundred years when we tried to do something similar in the past? So I think there's this nice balance. I get absolutely what you're talking about. I guess I'm an optimist, so I sometimes embrace the entrenched thinkers along the same pattern and say, okay, now what are they going to bring to the equation that's going to keep us grounded, those of us that sometimes, put our head above the clouds too much. So,
well, yeah, and I mean, you can look at this in another way, Jonathan. It's like, I have this still, I work a lot with like small business development folks, and I got into a conversation with a guy who was lamenting how bad the ideas were that sometimes come into his small business development center. And I was asking, like, challenging him, how do you actually know a good idea from a bad idea? Who's qualified to discern that? Because I guarantee you, if we were all sitting around circa 2005 and someone came to us and said, I got a great idea, we're going to rent my spare bedrooms out to strangers. Like, no one would have thought that, a priori, that was a great idea. So it's just an interesting dilemma. Like, how do we navigate the future rather than stay stuck in the past? That's really, I think, the dilemma here. So we're kind of winding down the clock here, Nick. Any final questions for Jonathan? I see that, Clint is asking how we can connect with Jonathan. I'm sure, we'll get to that at the end, how people can reach out to him. Any other questions, Nick, that we have as we wind down?
Just a comment I wanted to highlight and see if you had any last minute comments on this particular nuanced topic of integrating entrepreneurship into K-12 education. Camila is saying, in her opinion, entrepreneurship should be another E in the STEM education model. So I like that idea. My question is, if we're talking about it being a truly interdisciplinary play, should it not also be STEEAM, the STEAM with an A for the arts as well. I wanted to get your thoughts on that briefly, if you will.
Yeah, so let me just jump in there, Jonathan, and I'll turn it over to you. I think that might not be thinking about it in the right way, if I could be so bold. And another way to think about it is, there's nowhere in education, K through 20, K through whatever, there's no curriculum for an employee mindset. There's no course to teach you, here's how you think like an employee. It doesn't exist. And that's how I think about entrepreneurial mindset education. We need to make ourselves irrelevant, ourselves meaning Eli, Jonathan Ortmans, like it just needs to become so much a part of the fabric of who we are. We don't even talk about it or think about it. It just becomes a natural thing. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fairly simple, and I think we've stated this. I obviously, I'm a huge fan of all the benefits to society of teaching entrepreneurship, first of all, in every discipline in higher education, but also of making it part of the structured discipline we do at K through 12. So I would agree with that. I think it's just a question of making sure that we don't, because this happens in the entrepreneurship world, that, for example, politicians really have a hard time distinguishing between SME policy and entrepreneurship policy. And frankly, they're very, very different. They're both equally important, but that we don't, that we're careful to make sure that we explain what we mean by teaching entrepreneurship, that we emphasize that it's about the creative experiment part of it. It's not about, the things that, quite frankly, are much easier to teach. This notion of, understanding spreadsheets and marketing and some of the rigorous things that you need in order to be able to run a company, but it's very different thing that you would teach someone at an early stage. So that would be just, my observation consistent with, what we were talking about a few minutes ago. But I will conclude though with just, we're not concluding just yet, I know, but I do want to just make one other point on this, broadly speaking, on the entrepreneurship education before we wrap up. And that is that one of the things that we have observed for our generation now is that particularly with entrepreneurship education, entrepreneurs want, or people with an entrepreneur, they want to learn on demand. So first of all, secondly, they love peer networks. They want to learn from each other. And thirdly, I think they want to teach themselves. And certainly, I think there's certain things that you need to have taught to you. But when I look at, when I just generally, even outside of entrepreneurship, I look at how much my kids just teach themselves and don't even think about it throughout their entire life. This isn't just high school. This is like, they're like, well, I don't need a lesson in this. I mean, my son insisted on teaching himself saxophone. He plays the saxophone beautifully. He's never had a lesson in his life, and I am still to this day dumbfounded because I grew up. I had traditionally had lessons every single week. I had all these things going on, and I had this structured thing, and then I had a music scholarship and stuff, and I had to do all this thing. And he's done all this stuff, but he didn't want any formal instruction. He was like, I really would prefer, I can get it all online. Everything I need is available. I'm not sure that's a great, maybe that's not the good, the best example, but I do think that on demand and learning from each other and learning from self-directed through technology is becoming, for me, I think we passed that proverbial tipping point of it being very common, particularly in the entrepreneurship space. And I think this is the future of what we've got to see, and what we've got to look at is, what are the areas where people are getting misdirected and going in the wrong direction, that we've really got to do a better job at bringing in some of that more traditional structural guidance so that you get that right. But the good news is the initiative is there for people to be able to do that, and the technology is making it almost free for you to be able to do that from anywhere on the planet.
Thank you, Jonathan. That's a beautiful answer. It's a beautiful way to end. And I just want to, add, there's a fantastic paper. It was published in 2015 by the OECD called Entrepreneurship in Education. And one of the drums that OECD has been beating for years, and Nick just kindly put a link to that in the chat for those of you who are interested, but what they've been saying is that we need to recognize also, in addition to formal learning, informal and non-formal learning as really, really important. And I think that's just an important part of the conversation of shifting entrepreneurship from the perimeter to the core. When I look at entrepreneurs as if I were on a safari with night vision goggles, observing the everyday entrepreneur, they're always learning, but they're not. And so many of them weren't great students. But what you see are individuals that are constantly learning through social networks, through online courses, audiobooks, what have you. Again, the entrepreneurial journey creates a really, really powerful incentive to learn. I think that's the big message for educators here. So, Jonathan, thanks so much for taking time out of your busy, crazy busy life to join us for this. I'm eternally grateful for your willingness to do that. And we're going to wrap up now. And so, Jonathan, last question I have for you is, how can people connect with you?
Hold on one second. I have a little technical problem. I'll be right with you.
Okay, no worries.
That's a really easy question. One second, my camera died here a second, but I'll be right with you. So just to say, I think it's an easy way to do that. I'm more than happy if people just want to send me. You can either reach me on Twitter, J Ortmans, or you can send me an email, jonathan@genglobal.org, GEN global.org. And that's Jonathan. You can see it on the screen there, JONATHAN. I'll put it in the chat if you want. But feel free to send me email. Email's still, I use everything else, but email's still pretty reliable. So definitely something that more than happy to hear from any of you if you've got follow-up questions or ways that you'd like to get involved in GEN. I will point out that at GEN, we have our Global Entrepreneurship Congress, which is deliberately inclusive. We work with all economies around the world, and we make it free for people to attend. We'll have some virtual components this year, but it will be live again in November, in the middle of November. This year, it's going to be in the Middle East in November. We'll be doing it in Riyadh, and we'll be also having our Entrepreneurship World Cup finals at the same time in the same city. We have typically about 175,000 people from around the world that enter our annual Entrepreneurship World Cup celebration. So we'll have a lot going on. If you're enthusiastic about entrepreneurship and want to see the global picture, and you're maybe ready to get out and do some community building activities again, having been stuck at home for so long, and if the vaccine progress continues along the way, we hope to see many of you in person again. So, but obviously feel free to get in touch with us. More than happy to share more information about the work we do, either with our programs or the work we do in public policy or in research. And thrilled to get to know more of this community.
Excellent. Thank you, Jonathan, and greatly appreciate it. So before you all go, I want to share my screen for just a quick minute. Okay, so just really quickly, thank you again for attending this webinar. I want to introduce who we are. My name is Gary Schoniger. I'm the founder of the Entrepreneurial Learning Initiative. We are the world's leading provider of entrepreneurial mindset education, training, and professional development. That's what we do. A big part of what we do is training educators how to bring entrepreneurial mindset in an interdisciplinary way into the classroom. So we're also the creators of the Ice House Entrepreneurship Program, which you may or may not have heard of. It was birthed at Kauffman. We started with initial funding at the Kauffman Foundation, which is where I met Jonathan. The Ice House program has taken us across the world. It's being deployed in ways we could have never imagined. If you want to learn more about the Ice House program, we have monthly webinars that sort of dig in a little bit under the hood to understand how that program works. We've now trained nearly 3,000 facilitators on 5 continents how to implement that program. If you want to learn more, this coming Tuesday, we have our monthly Ice House webinar, which we call the Entrepreneurial Mindset Education 101 webinar. I'm also very excited to share with you something. This is brand new. We just released this yesterday. It's our new white paper called the Entrepreneurial Mindset Imperative. It's available on our website at elimindset.com. I encourage all of you to download that paper, share it, read it as you see fit. Lastly, we have a brand new program we're launching this summer to address some of these gaps that we're talking about. It's an Entrepreneurial Mindset Summer Boot Camp, and it's designed for high school age children. It's an 8-week intensive online course. We're inviting students from across the globe to participate together to develop, to become involved, to be exposed to the fundamental aspects of entrepreneurial thinking, to self-organize in groups to create entrepreneurial projects that help them develop entrepreneurial attitudes and skills. So you can learn more about that also on our website. I'll hope will join us next month for our Entrepreneurship and Education webinar series with my good friend Melina Stoicheva, to the amazing things she's doing across Europe to promote entrepreneurship and education. So that's my story. I'm sticking with it. Again, Jonathan, thank you for being here. I've enjoyed speaking and interacting with all of you. Have a great afternoon, morning, whatever time it is in your corner of the world. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Gary.
Bye, guys.